Hi everyone, welcome to our first Loadbalancer.org roundtable discussion. My name's Roz, I work in the marketing department at Load Balancer, and we're a tech company, an international provider of load balancing application delivery products and services. So today I have with me three wonderful techie enthusiasts that also work with me here at Load Balancer. Hi everyone.
Hi Roz.
Hello.
So I would love it if you guys could introduce yourself. Andy, why don't you go first? Introduce yourself, explain your job role, things like that.
Sure. My name is Andrew Zach, and I head the front-end team here at Loadbalancer.org. I oversee the front-end development, and we use the Angular framework, and yeah, lots of cool modern tech here at Load Balancer.
That's awesome. Thanks, Andy. Who's next?
I can go. So my name's Andrew Howe. I'm a technical author and architect here at Loadbalancer.org. So I'm a part of the solutions department. So primarily we deal with getting the best solution to our customers and advancing things like documentation and all of the ancillary tasks to support our customers and our product.
That's awesome. Love that. And Peter.
Right, well, I'm Peter. I work in the support department, and I answer all the customer queries and questions, and help our customers get their load balancer working.
Nice, I love that. Thanks guys for joining me. So today we're going to be talking about open source. We're going to be looking at what it is, why and how we use the software in our products, the benefits, and we're also going to be doing a little bit of myth busting. So we're going to be unpacking a few assumptions about open source, and these guys are going to unleash their wisdom on us. We're also going to look at the highlights and the takeaways of the FOSDEM virtual conference that you guys went to and attended recently. So why don't we just get into it? To kick us off, would someone like to tell us what open source is in basic terms to, say, a novice like me?
Well, I'd be happy to do that, Ross. I mean, at the end of the day, open source is really about having access to the source code for your tools, for your programs, whatever you want to do. It's much, much easier to do it if you are able to modify the tool for your specific use case. If you're able to fix bugs, if you're able to add features. It's basically about having that power. And it's also a movement. It's a movement of people who recognize this. And I don't know if anyone else wants to add on to that, really. I mean, I think that's it at its heart.
I agree. And yeah, I think, as you say, it's software that's freely available for anyone to use and improve on. It really opens up the possibility for anyone to innovate and take on new projects and build them and cater them to the environment that they're trying to use the software in, and perhaps make it better. So
I think as well, it's important that if you're developing a product or a new project, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's all of this code and all of these existing projects that you can take and combine to make something that's greater than the sum of its parts. So you don't have to start from scratch. You can stand on the shoulder of giants, as it were, and use some existing proven technology and incorporate that into something else.
I love what you said there about standing on the shoulders of giants. I like that analogy. So when I was just starting out at Load Balancer, I sat down with one of the managers who was talking to us about kind of how we came to be and things like that. And they mentioned how from the beginning we kind of were using open source software in our product. And so would you guys be able to kind of expand on that? Like, what are the benefits of us using open source software in our products?
I'd be happy to give that one a go. So first, let's look at the question of how we use open source software. So In our load balancer appliance, we use free and open source software from the ground up. So for the operating system, which is the software that manages the basic functionality of the appliance, we use Linux, also known as GNU/Linux, which is the world's largest free and open source project. And on top of that, we use a range of free software applications to provide different functionality. So some of the projects we use include HA Proxy, LVS with LDirectD, and Apache. But I think more importantly is looking at the question of why we use this software. So when we're talking about free and open source software, when we say free, what we're talking about is freedom. So with free software, you have the ability to run a program however you like for any purpose. You can study how it works and change its code to make it do what you want it to. You can share that program with others, and you get to improve the program as well and share your improvements with the rest of the world. So the whole community benefits. And it's these important freedoms are what allowed us to piece together different free software projects to create our load balancer appliance. So we were able to build upon thousands of hours of work, millions of lines of code, and decades of development from people all over the world. So the important thing is that free and open source software empowers users, and it's empowered us as a company because free software puts the users in control of the software. And it's those important software freedoms that have put Loadbalancer.org where it is today. That's
awesome. Anyone else want to expand on that?
I like how you said that freeze and freedom. I think I read somewhere that someone wrote that open source software is free as in freedom and not freeze and beer. And I think that pretty much, sums it up. Because at the end of the day, free software doesn't necessarily mean it's free to maintain because someone needs to. But it does mean you've got the freedom to use it and improve on it and use it, as you need to. So,
I mean, just coming in there, there's this whole history of open source software versus free software, and I mean, these days the two camps are sort of united. But I mean, there is a difference. There is software where you can see the source code and see how it works, but you don't have the ability to add to it because that invalidates the copyright. So you're very limited in what you can do. And once you've seen it, of course, then you can't write something similar because that's derivative of the work.
Yeah.
Whereas with free software, you just have these guarantees and they're pretty ironclad. But that you will always be able to use the software and always do what you want.
Yeah, it's one thing to be able to audit software, right? To be able to read through the code, and it's completely another to be able to do that and then also make changes if you need to.
Yeah, we could replace HA proxy and we could replace IPVS, but why would we want to? I mean, HA proxy is just so good, and so is IPVS. I mean, why throw it away just because you didn't write it?
I think that's a good point. And as well, because of the power of free software, these technologies are ubiquitous. They're used in some of the largest corporations and companies in the world. So they have a proven track record of working and working well. So that means that everyone else can take advantage of the fact that their software is being thoroughly tested. And if a company deploys the software and there's a problem, then they have the freedom to go and fix it, as I think Andy mentioned earlier. So you get the benefit of those fixes from the wider community as well. So it's kind of a win-win for everybody.
Oh, that's great. So you said it does things like it gives you freedom, it empowers people, it allows you to collaborate and improve upon what other people have already created. And let's do a bit of myth busting here. I'm going to throw a few statements at you guys, and then you guys can discuss it as of when. So first myth, there is no support for open source software.
Yeah, I'd be happy to start that one off.
Sure.
So I think it really depends on the software that you're using. Generally speaking, if it's a well-known and well-used piece of software that is open source, then you can sort of expect the support to be behind it. And going back, I think as we've said already that if the project exists and it solves the problem that you're trying to set out to fix, then if there's no support behind it, because it's free, because it's open, you're able to then do it yourself or employ someone to do it on your behalf. So I wouldn't say that there is no support in open source software, because there is. It's just that there are different routes in that regards into how you get that support. And I think it also comes back to people thinking how open source software just doesn't always work properly. You know, when you find that there is projects that are well supported, like HA Proxy, that are used quite heavily, the work behind open source project is tested through time, as we've said. So yeah, I definitely think the support is there.
If I can just interject there.
Of course.
My job is literally to support open source software, so I can quite categorically say that there is support for open source software.
I think you can flip the question on its head as well. So rather than saying that there's no support for open source software, well, you could say the same thing about proprietary software. How much proprietary software gets abandoned, where the maintainers move on, the company discontinues the software, and if the company that's developing that software that you're using, if they don't continue to roll out security updates and feature updates, then you may very quickly find yourself in a situation where a piece of software that you rely on heavily no longer works, and you have no route to ever make it work again because you don't have access to the source code. So I think the question could be that proprietary software has a problem with support long term, certainly.
Definitely. And I think moreover on that, if you find a problem in proprietary software, you're heavily relying on the company behind it, like you said, to fix it. Whereas in open source software, you've got the world who are basically behind the project to help fix that problem. So you've got more than one or a set of people who are trying to fix a common issue in a piece of software that you know, a large set of people are using. So
if it's a really big issue, then yes, the whole world comes together and fixes it. We've seen that happen time and again. But if it's a tiny issue or one that's specific just to you, a lot of the time you will have to do the work yourself. And I mean, on the plus side, if you were going proprietary software, the big company would simply not dedicate resources for your one problem. But with open source software, even if you yourself are not an expert, you can hire an expert to work for you. So I mean,
yeah, and I guess that depends on the scope of the problem that you're trying to fix. If it's a problem that it caters to more than just yourself, then there is, you know, going to be the support to want to get it done. But yeah, like you said, if it's just, you know, very unique to yourself, at least you've got the freedom to find what best route to do so to get that done.
Is it a lot about like accountability and having people kind of check, like you have loads of people checking your code and therefore you're all able to come in with these different perspectives? Is that one of the benefits of it?
oh, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely.
There is a saying, goes way back, with enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. And it's true. If you have 1,000 people auditing the code, then you know, one person might miss it, 10 people might miss it, 1,000 people. Someone's going to notice it, and only one person has to notice.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. So what about, I know that cybersecurity has been a lot in the news recently with everyone going remote. So what would you say to the myth that open source software is less secure than what you guys mentioned earlier, proprietary software?
Well, I would say what I just said a second ago. I mean, to build on that, this software is widely used. I mean, Linux is, by some counts, the most popular operating system on the planet at the moment. It's possibly not the most popular desktop operating system, although it's certainly making gains there. But in terms of servers and the Android platform, that's 50% of mobile phones, I don't know the actual numbers, is based on Linux. So there is a massive, massive deployment of Linux in the world. Just taking one example. So it gets tested an awful lot. It's not some niche thing where it's never being used in the real world. It's out there and it's being used. And I mean, that's similar for other applications like the Apache web server, the Nginx web server. You name an application, Firefox. Firefox is very popular, and constantly attacked. It is very secure for what it is. Similar, the Chromium browser, which is Google's take on it, is very heavily developed. I could keep naming projects, but I mean, the fact is, these things are out there and they do get tested.
Yeah, definitely. And I would say that following the open source theme here, larger projects, especially like the ones you've mentioned, are generally sort of maintained by some sort of governing body of open source people, just to make sure that the proper practices and peer reviewing processes are in place to ensure that any code that's contributed sort of follows the standards that that project sets out when people go to contribute code, and to make sure that it follows the ethos of that project that they're developing on. So so when it comes to security and code reliability, generally speaking, larger projects follow a sort of workflow process that includes those sort of peer reviewing processes and security checking practices to ensure that those things are mitigated as best as possible. So
I think there's a counter argument that some might make, specifically regarding some of the recent big vulnerabilities that have been discovered in open source code. Just a few weeks ago, there was a massive vulnerability in the sudo application, which I believe had been in the code for perhaps decades. So some people might say that open source code is still as vulnerable as proprietary code because there are these huge vulnerabilities that affect hundreds of thousands of systems. But on the other side of the coin, what I would argue is that without access to the source code and having security developers and researchers being able to probe this code and try and find these vulnerabilities, they would never come to fruition. They would never be discovered, and they would never be fixed. If you look at proprietary software where we don't have access to the source code, who knows how many enormously critical vulnerabilities have been lying in their code bases for decades and decades. We just don't know. At least with open source, while yes, there are vulnerabilities and there are serious problems that come up from time to time, we're aware of them and we have visibility of these issues. Whereas with proprietary software, you have no visibility and you just have to take the word of the company or the developer that their code is secure. You have no way of checking.
Third myth. Open source software is not enterprise level software. I know you guys touched on it before, but maybe expand a little bit more on that for us.
Just one statistic that I think is quite interesting. As of 2017, the top 500 supercomputers in the world, every single one of them runs Linux. And these are big universities, these are governmental organizations, all 500 of the most powerful machines in the world all run Linux. I think that's kind of testament to the power and usefulness of free and open source software.
Wow.
Yeah. Linux on the supercomputer and Linux on your teeny tiny Raspberry Pi computer. That's quite some scale, that is.
Yeah, definitely.
And I mean, somewhere in the middle, there is the enterprise level servers and big data clusters and whatnot. I think it absolutely is enterprise level and has been for a while.
yeah, I think it solely depends on the project though. But I wouldn't say open source software cannot be at any enterprise level piece of software. I mean, that is probably quite a vague definition. Enterprise being what? It's used amongst big large businesses. At the end of the day, does that make proprietary software enterprise? I don't think open source software has to be proprietary in order for it to be considered enterprise. Just because there's not a large central funding source in order to maintain a project doesn't necessarily make it at a level quality higher than the open source, the software that's ready available for people to contribute and read. And I think the likes of Red Hat and some of these other businesses that have made successful businesses based off open source software has kind of just proven that.
Nice. So building on from that, what would you guys say then well, you said in some senses a lot of people use open source software to some degree. So what would you say to organizations that are maybe wary or reluctant of like embracing open source software, as maybe some have?
The proprietary software that you may be using in your company is probably built off or on using open source software. A lot of proprietary software uses modules that are open source. So I wouldn't shy away from it just because you feel that the code is readily available for people to see and use. It doesn't make it that it's not, not enterprise ready or not secure or anything less than what you would consider enterprise ready software. It's I think time and the likes of the projects that we've mentioned have only proven that they are just as reliable and can be used in the most critical deployments in the industry. So
it's a very different model as well. Like when you look at perhaps the total cost of ownership of a free and open source solution versus a proprietary solution. On the one hand, the proprietary solution, you're probably going to be forking out a significant amount of money for licenses to run the software. And you can run it on a certain number of machines, and then you have to pay more money. So when you're moving to free and open source software, you don't have to worry about those specific costs. But on the free software side, you might have more issues in terms of deployment, and you might have to hire some consultancy services. So there are different ways of looking. It's a very different model, and the costings are quite different. But I think it's worth saying that for pretty much any proprietary or enterprise solution that you may already have, whether that's an Office suite, there's LibreOffice, or OpenOffice, there are solutions for that. If you've got a mail server and you're using Microsoft Exchange, for example, then there are dozens and dozens of well-proven open source mail solutions. So whatever piece of software that you have that's proprietary, whatever software stack you're using at the moment, there's a very good chance that there's a mature open source project that you can replace it with. And there are certainly plenty of consultants and plenty of support opportunities if you want to have a commercial level of enterprise support for that system you're putting in.
That is a good point. And I think, especially from my perspective with software today, a lot of companies invest in particular solutions because of the support behind it. So it's not necessarily because it's proprietary. It's because they know at the end of the day, if something breaks, they can speak to somebody to get the situation resolved. So, which open source can offer just as much as proprietary. So at the end of the day, something simple as a text editor shouldn't necessarily be kept from the general public to use. That is probably considered a necessity nowadays. And yet it still has some sort of licensing behind it. And what the open source community says is that these sort of tools should be available for everyone to use. And if you're using it outside of the scope of general use and you need the support, then those options are there for you.
There's no reason not to use open source software at enterprise level, but beyond just using it, you don't have to embrace the idea of open source. You don't have to extend, improve, and give back your changes to the community. But why not? I just think maybe that might be. It's not a requirement, but you might find there are benefits to it. You really might that are not immediately obvious.
I think at Load Balancer, there's a number of projects that we've contributed to as best as we can.
True.
And we've reaped those benefits in return by what they've offered us in ways the general community has improved on the open source projects that we use. So it's a give and take sort of scenario. Every contribution, anything that you can offer to a project helps everybody who uses it. And in that sense, the money you invest into helping an open source project make it better inevitably comes back to you. So,
and I mean, I do have to say that I'm not just saying that, we do eat our own dog food here at Loadbalancer.org, and that might be the wrong way to introduce your project, Andy. But I mean, I really think that the Pulse HA, which you work on, is the example of that we give back to the community.
Yeah, definitely. I think as a potential solution to ensure that people keep their services online as best as we can, and as a key component to our load balancers product, Pulse HA being the cluster communications manager that we use to ensure that floating IPs are brought up when a particular appliance fails, is definitely a way that we can contribute back to the general public, to the community, so that they can have the same solutions in their own deployments.
So I think it's important to highlight some of our other contributions as well. So for example, in the past, we've funded development of specific functions for HA proxy. So email alerts in HA proxy, that was a need of our customers. And that's something we funded a developer to go and add to the project. And it's widely used and it's part of the HA proxy project to this day. In the past, we also funded the author of LDirector-D to add similar functionality to that product as well. And in a wider sense as well, we also contribute back in terms of documentation, in terms of blogs. A lot of these materials help people to either get started with an open source deployment, or gives them some ideas of things to try, or it just gives them some ideas of how they might configure their open source solution to load balance whatever application they're looking at, because there's a good chance that we've tested it already and we've got some published documentation on how to load balance that particular product. So in a wider sense as well, I think we contribute back in terms of the ancillary stuff, the docs, the blogs and that sort of thing too.
I think we also contribute in terms of costs indirectly as well, because as a company, because we use these tools, these open source solutions, inevitably the money that we spend on our employees, supporting it in our products, inevitably helps support the projects themselves. And I believe it was you, Pete, who found or helped find one of the issues in HA proxy, the division by zero, and then inevitably helped find a fix for it. So
that was a good one. I mean, that only affected 3 customers, I think, and we only saw that. I don't know how many customers we have, Ross. A lot. We have a lot of customers, and 3 of them ran into this issue, and that was not all at once. That was over several years. So I mean, it really is a case of with enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow, because just because I saw this 3 times, I knew that, okay, this is a pattern, that this is happening to these people, and we had to go back and find out that it was some ridiculously specific set of circumstances. You had to be using the feedback agent with weighted least problem connections and multi-threading. And if you didn't have all 3 of those and luck, then you would never hit this bug. So, it is very much a case of with enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow.
In terms of contributing to the community as well and the benefits it has to a business, I think it gives a business credentials. It makes them look good in the eyes of potential employees. You might find that if you're contributing code back and you're being active in these communities, you're going to start attracting talent that you might not otherwise have seen. So I think it's good for businesses in terms of giving them credentials and attracting talent that they would otherwise potentially miss. I mean, that's why I came to Load Balancer in the first place, was because it's a Linux-based project. So I'm proof of that in action.
Oh, that's awesome. I didn't know that. That's awesome. So we talked a lot about community, and you guys, I know you went to FOSDEM, which I don't want to get this wrong, so I wrote it down. Stands for Free and Open Source Software Developers Europeans Meeting. So let's hear a highlight from you guys and any new things that you've learned. It'll be so interesting to hear how you found the virtual conference as well. I know that you guys before, it's in Brussels, so we saw many pictures of you guys that you sent through when you last went. So yeah, tell us more about FOSDEM.
Yeah, FOSDEM this year was definitely different. Not quite the Brussels experience as last year was. They utilized the Matrix network this year, which is kind of like a chat network like Slack, except it's all end-to-end encrypted, which is really cool. And they integrated widgets, so you can see in a particular chat room the current presentation for a particular development room was discussing at that time, and then giving you also the opportunity to write, speak to others and ask questions. So I think for an online conference, it was done pretty well. As for a takeaway, one of the emulation room was pretty cool. I watched the PlayStation 2 emulation talk, and it just basically went over the architecture for the PlayStation 2 and the areas that they had to consider and look into in order to properly emulate the console. So yeah, a pretty cool takeaway.
It was very well done, as Andy says. It's not quite as good as the real thing, unfortunately. would recommend anyone watching, if you're interested in open source, if you want to be part of the community, or you are part of the community, and you're in Europe, of course, go to FOSDEM 1 year. It is an experience that's really worth it, just meeting all the developers and contributors. I was very impressed by a talk that was given on monitoring file descriptors on Sunday. And a lot of it was stuff that I already knew, but a lot of it, well, some of it was new stuff, particularly the contributions that Facebook have made to the Linux kernel, and the performance improvements that brings. And I mean, that's one of the advantages of one of these sorts of conferences, because I could have found this out by looking at the Linux kernel documentation. It's kept pretty up to date, and anything new is bound to be in there. But I didn't notice it until it was brought to my attention in a talk. And now that I know about it, I'm going to be experimenting with it.
I really enjoyed FOSDEM this year. As has already been touched on, it's hard to meet the quality and the expectation of the physical conference. This was the first time in 7 years I hadn't been there in person, so it was a little bit bittersweet. And there was certainly, that was touched on in the closing talk, when they were talking about how it's an opportunity to meet people who you only get to see once a year, and that's very true. So it's certainly missing out on that regard. But the talks were top notch as always. They were very, very good. I saw a really interesting talk about the Jitsi software, which is an open source equivalent to software such as Zoom. And Jitsi allows people to do video conferencing. And they were talking about how they scaled their service during the beginning of the COVID pandemic. Of course, lots of people suddenly finding they need to do meetings and video conferencing. And they were talking about how they use HA proxy and how they scaled up their service to make it highly available. So lots of things that we're quite familiar with here, but that was very interesting to hear. And some rather touching stories about how some of the people who'd been using their service had got in touch and said what an absolute lifesaver it had been during the pandemic. So it was really touching to see and hear about some of the human aspects of how free and open source software has affected people and made people's lives a little bit better during what's otherwise quite a difficult time. So, yeah.
The human aspect is an important aspect, actually, of open source software. I mean, not from the technical point of view, but from the community point of view. I mean, what you've just said has just reminded me of the keynote talk a couple of years ago, putting 6 million people on the map, which was about OpenStreetMap, actually a project that was started near us. But I mean, that's a massively social thing. Just open source maps and mapping servers. That's, yeah. There is a large community aspect to open source software.
I think FOSDEM is a lot about the people just as much as it is about the talks. It's definitely an experience. You go there to meet like-minded people. You go there to learn and like Pete said, there are topics that you probably know of, but you still go to them because there's always things that you can learn. There's always things that you don't know. And it's not just open source. If you're an IT person and you like technology and you want to learn new things, FOSDEM is fantastic. It is free. It's an opportunity to again meet new people and take on new information across a number of subjects. It is fantastic. And usually the day before the event, you'd go. They have a meet and greet. You go to the pub, have a few drinks. I say a few. You have a lot to drink. Just so that of the day you're ready and on it to take on all that information. But at the same time, there's just an endless source of information to take on from very clever people. So, and the ending note from this past event also touched on about just making sure that you think about the other people around you and your families, and to make sure that you speak to them and share the love, basically, especially in these times. So it's not just about the tech, it's also about the people.
That's great. Thank you guys so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom. And I love everything that you've said about it being all about community, of looking after each other, of empowering each other and inspiring and collaborating. Does anyone have any parting words of wisdom to say, like a young person that, or old, they can be any age, but that is new to all of this and is maybe thinking of going to things like FOSDEM?
Okay, I think I will. Don't be afraid to. It's really that simple. Your contributions, however small you think they might be, they're probably actually something that someone else wants as well. So do it for yourself, but share, and you will probably find that there are lots of people who will actually benefit from whatever you're able to contribute. You would be surprised.
I think to a young person or a new person starting to get involved in the free and open source movement, I'd say just get involved, get stuck in. There's a community there waiting to welcome you. Whether you're able to code or if you have other contributions to make, there will be a way that you can give back and you can contribute to the community. And people will be happy to help. They'll be happy to mentor you, whether that's going to your local Linux user group or going to Brussels to a conference, whatever it is, just get involved. People are very friendly and it might just change your life for the better.